This is part one of a two-part video series on why Jon and Sansa as a political match makes sense. This isn't about them being secretly in love, though we don't rule that out, but why we think they're the likely endgame political match that can bring Westeros together. We're going to start off by discussing arranged marriages and why they aren't so bad, and sometimes they even turn out happy. Throughout history, arranged marriages have been the norm for kings and queens. This is because they can ensure that their potential spouse actually brings something to the table and will help them rule, whether this be money, ally. Most of the time, arranged marriages on Game of Thrones means that a woman is forced into doing something for her family that she really doesn't want to do. Often she ends up raped or molested because of it. So, a great example is Robert Baratheon and Cersei. Cersei's basically his broodmare, and she is abused by him. Sansa in the books is molested by Tyrion. Either way, even in the show, if she doesn't, it's kind of a child, or not kind of, it's definitely a child marriage. She's also forced to marry Ramsay, who flat out rapes her. Um, Dany is given to Khal Drogo and contemplates killing herself because the rapes at the beginning are so horrible.
George R. R. Martin has been quite open about his inspirations for the A Song of Ice and Fire book series, including the English Wars of the Roses in the 15th century. Now, we are going to talk about the parallels between a possible John and Sansa marriage and the final couple of the Wars of the Roses, Elizabeth York and Henry Tudor. Now, the Starks and the Yorks actually share quite a lot of parallels, as the conflicts in both the books and in the Wars of the Roses were kicked off by the beheading of Richard, Duke of York, who parallels Ned, by Margaret of Anjou, who parallels Cersei Lannister. Sansa and Elizabeth of York share a lot of parallels in particular. Both are the eldest daughters of a high noble house, Elizabeth of York being the eldest daughter of King Edward IV and his wife Elizabeth Woodville, and Sansa being the eldest daughter of Ned and Catelyn Stark. Elizabeth was born a princess, and Sansa was born a lady, and would later become a princess when her brother Robb became King of the North. Beyond that, both had very similar life journeys. After the death of their fathers, they were forced into hiding. Elizabeth into a monastery, and Sansa first as a captive in King's Landing, and then as a bastard in the Vale. And actually, Elizabeth was also a bastard for a while, as as a political move by her enemies. Her parents' marriage was annulled, as Edward IV may have been married to someone before Elizabeth Woodville, making all of their children bastards. Just as Sansa hid as the bastard of Lane Stone while attempting to escape from Cersei, as her status made her too dangerous. And both of them share a parallel in the death of their brothers. Elizabeth of York's brothers were Edward V and Prince Richard, who were the lost princes in the Tower of London, who may or may not have been murdered by their uncle Richard III. At any rate, they disappeared mysteriously. This is very similar to how Sansa lost her brothers Bran and Rickon at the hands of their family's ward, Theon Greyjoy. Now, Bran and Rickon were not actually murdered by Theon, but it is thought they were, and it was all very mysterious. And after the death of their brothers, both Elizabeth and Sansa would become the heirs to their respective houses. It is repeated time and time again in both the books and the show that Sansa Stark is the key to the North, and she is the heir to Winterfell. Um, Tywin Lannister married her to his son Tyrion just for the purpose of taking the North, and later in the show, the Boltons do the same thing in order to consolidate their power. The same thing would happen with Elizabeth, as she would be politically married off to Henry Tudor. Is actually interesting to note that by some accounts, Elizabeth of York looked very much like her mother, Elizabeth Woodville, much like how Sansa is to look very much like her mother Catelyn. Now, moving on to the parallels between Jon Snow and Henry VII or Henry Tudor. Now, in the books, there are actually three characters that parallel Henry Tudor quite a bit, those being young Griff, Daenerys Targaryen, and Jon Snow. In the show, it is just Dany and Jon. Now, Jon and Henry Tudor both have a lot of similarities. So, Henry's claim to the throne came through his mother, Margaret Beaufort, who was descended from John of Gaunt, the fourth son of Edward III, and his mistress, Catherine Swynford. So, John of Gaunt and Catherine Swynford would later be married, and their children born before they were married were legitimized but barred from ever inheriting the throne. So the Beauforts were actually a bastard line of the House of Lancaster, much as how John himself was a bastard. Um, on the other side of Henry's family, his father, Edmund Tudor, was the product of a love affair between the Queen Dowager Catherine of Valois and her lover and later husband, Owen Tudor, which is very similar to the affair between Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark. Both were very controversial and ended up getting the couples in a lot of trouble. Henry also had to go into exile when he was young because his life was in danger during the Wars of the Roses, much as how John was hidden by his uncle Ned in order to protect him from any possible retributions from Robert Baratheon. Now, Now, it is also interesting to note that Henry Tudor's Welsh heritage also connects to John's own Targaryen heritage, as the symbol of Wales is a red dragon, which nicely parallels the red dragon on a black background that is the Targaryen sigil. Now, after a long time in exile, Henry Tudor would return to England and win the Battle of Bosworth against Richard III and become King of England. However, he still had not completely secured the nation after that battle. So, in order to unite the Lancaster and York factions, he married Elizabeth of York. Um, Henry is also known as the Winter King, as his reign was the winter before the spring of Henry VIII. But this is interesting to note as it's quite close to the old Stark titles, the Kings of Winter, prior to the Targaryen conquest. And it's also interesting to note that John's claim to the north comes through his mother Lyanna, just as Henry's claim to England came through his mother Margaret Beaufort. Now, although Elizabeth of York and Henry Tudor's marriage was entirely political and very much arranged, it was actually a very successful one. They had numerous children and were reportedly very much in love. Elizabeth was known to be a very wise and beautiful and traditional queen, and Henry was the king that brought back stability after the Wars of the Roses had ravaged England for so long. They were a very well suited couple, and they ruled very well together. And this already parallels Jon and Sansa's relationship as the King of the North and the Lady of Winterfell, as they have worked together to rebuild the North and prepare for the winter, the long night. Already, Jon and Sansa have stepped into the roles of Elizabeth and Henry, working together to stabilize their kingdom and work for their people, while at the same time having a very close and healthy relationship between themselves.
Speaking of arranged marriages, John and Sansa seem to match the trope of the perfectly arranged marriage. As you can see from the trope description on the screen, it's essentially when two people are forced to be together by things outside of their control, but soon realize that it was destiny all along. When John and Sansa were younger, they were never as close with each other as they were with the rest of their siblings, and both didn't seem to match the idea the other had of their perfect spouse. And John never thought he'd end up with a pretty girl and always pictured himself with an outsider more like Arya, whereas Sansa never thought she'd end up with a bastard and pictured herself marrying the queen. But being forced to reclaim Winterfell together, they realized that they'd found everything they'd been looking for in each other. The first arranged marriages we listed all ended badly, but here's some examples that fill the trope I mentioned above and could foreshadow Jon and Sansa being happy together.
Edmure originally doesn't want to be in an arranged marriage, especially with a Frey. He wants to be able to choose his own bride, and basically he wants her to be hot. Um, he is happily surprised when he sees Rosalind, and she's very adorable and nice to him. Ultimately, this ends horribly, but there's a moment of hope.
Another positive arranged marriage in Game of Thrones is Myrcella and Trystane. While the two of them never actually married, they did fall in love with each other. So much so that Myrcella refused to return to King's Landing when Jaime came to rescue her, and instead demanded that she stay with Trystane because she was in love with him. The best foreshadowing for Jon and Sansa's political marriage, though, is the marriage between Ned and Catelyn. While Catelyn and Ned weren't close at first, they built their relationship stone by stone, and by the end they were deeply in love with each other. They represent the only healthy marriage in Game of Thrones or A Song of Ice and Fire. As well as being a good representation of positive arranged marriages, they also share many similarities with Jon and Sansa and could work to foreshadow their relationship. And while the characters themselves are very similar, we're going to focus on the political similarities their relationships share. Both Jon and Ned are the second son of a great lord who unexpectedly became the leader of their house when the first son was murdered. And just like Catelyn, Sansa is the eldest daughter of a great lord expected to marry into another great family. And both relationships would unite two great houses against a common enemy, and coincidentally, both times the enemy would be a Targaryen.